Hello, everyone, and thank you for dialing in and participating to our webinar today on engaging stakeholders on climate risks and opportunities. My name is Nancy Meyer, and I am the Director of Corporate Engagement here at C2ES, and I'm pleased to be hosting this conversation with you today. We had over 400 people register, so we know that there's a lot of interest in how cities and businesses and others are working to analyze and disclose their climate-related risks and opportunities, as well as how to communicate those to their stakeholders. But before we dive in to the content of today's webinar, I just wanted to take care of a few housekeeping items. First of all, I wanted to note that this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted to our C2ES YouTube page following the broadcast. Also, because there are so many participants, we will use the GoToWebinar chat box for questions. And you can find that chat function on the right-hand side of your webinar screen that comes up in the control panel. There should be a pull down for questions, and you can feel free to submit your questions at any time, and I can raise those for our panelists during the discussion. So as soon as you have a question, feel free to go ahead and drop it in there. So to go ahead and get started here, I wanted to give you an overview of what we're going to cover today. First of all, I'm going to kick things off with a brief introduction and some more information about C2ES. And then I'll lead into some background about the growing interest in climate and financial disclosure, particularly around Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, which really has been central to getting more companies and organizations engaged on the topic of climate disclosure. After that, we're going to lead into our expert presentations, and we're going to hear from all the folks that you see here on the screen, including Sarah Fort from Vinson Elkins on the rapidly evolving climate disclosure landscape. We have Bill Brady from Exelon to discuss the assessment and disclosure of climate risks and the business implications of that. And lastly, we're going to hear from Susie Torienti with the City of Miami Beach and get a city perspective on how they're addressing climate resilience and engaging with their stakeholders on this issue as well. So now's a good time for me to give a quick introduction of each of our speakers. I'll start with Bill. Bill Brady is the Vice President of Corporate Environmental Strategy at Exelon. He leads their safety and environmental function and is responsible for ensuring effective governance of these issues at Exelon. He recently has been overseeing the company's efforts to address investor expectations around disclosing climate-related financial risks and opportunities. So look forward to hearing from Bill. Next, we have Sarah Fort. She is Senior Associate of Mergers and Acquisitions and Capital Markets at Vinson Elkins. Her practice areas include corporate governance, board representation, and securities law. She advises clients, and that includes both public companies and their boards, on corporate governance, securities law, and regulatory matters. She also advises them on shareholder engagement and corporate governance activism, proxy and periodic disclosure, internal and disclosure controls and procedures, among many other topics. So we look forward to hearing from Sarah. And then last but not least, we have Suzanne Torienti, who is the Chief Resilience Officer and Assistant City Manager at the City of Miami Beach. She has served the Miami-Dade County for nearly 30 years as a public administrator, or the area rather. And her sustainability and resilience portfolio includes planning, building, coding, compliance, and environmental and sustainability. She is also currently leading the effort to develop an action-oriented citywide resiliency strategy, as well as for the broader Greater Miami and Beaches strategy. So looking forward to hearing Susie's perspective when it comes to the City of Miami Beach. As I'd mentioned, we will have Q&A, and we're going to be saving most of that Q&A for the end of the presentations. But if you do have specific questions for a specific panelist that come up sooner, it's possible that I might ask them sooner. So don't hesitate to go ahead and drop your questions in. And then with that, let me just begin by saying a few words about C2ES. So Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, we're an independent, nonprofit, and nonpartisan organization. We've been around for over 20 years. We work with policymakers at the state, local, and federal level. And one of our hallmarks is that we actively engage with the business community on policy. And one of our ultimate goals is establishing a market-based mechanism as an economy-wide solution to reduce national GHG emissions. And we also work just more broadly and generally on finding solutions that reduce emissions, that grow the use of clean energy, and also build resilience to climate impacts. I also wanted to mention that we were one of the first groups of its kind to engage with business on climate change policy, and we're still one of the largest of its kind. And so what I have here is a slide with some of the companies that we work with on the corporate side. And my role here at C2ES is to manage the activities of the Business Environmental Leadership Council, or our BELC, which is all of our businesses. As you can see, it's a very unique membership. We represent a diverse range of sectors that includes top companies in the power, manufacturing, transportation, tech, oil and gas, and finance sectors, among others. And one of our key attributes of the sector, or this group rather, is that it's multi-sectoral. And so unlike trade associations, companies can talk to other companies outside of their own industry on climate policy and climate strategy, which is really valuable. And a lot of the stakeholder work that we do with policymakers actually involves engaging this group of companies with others and trying to really move the needle on climate action. So I'm really proud to be working at C2ES with this group of companies. Now to dive in a little bit more on the topic of today's webinar on climate disclosure, I wanted to just start off with a little bit of a preview or a highlight of how we are here today and what got us to where we are. And so, as you can see, climate disclosure is not new. It got kicked off nearly 2 decades ago with GRI and CDP in the early 2000s, and really interest has grown from there. As far back as 2010, the SEC issued its first guidance on climate disclosure, and then shortly thereafter, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB, was established in 2011. And I'll just mention, for those of you who are interested in more information about what SASB's work in this area, we held a webinar with some folks at SASB and CDSB that talked about how they're revamping some of their guidance in light of some of the changing disclosure requirements in the landscape. But then beyond that, in more recent years, we've seen a greater interest coming from the investor sector. I think Larry Fink with BlackRock is always a pretty good bellwether of these issues, and he issued his first CEO letter on long-term growth and the focus of that, and continues to write about this in his annual CEO letter in more recent years. And then that leads me to where we are today, and some of what we're going to talk about today, which is around the establishment of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Mark Carney, who is the chair of the Bank of England and was the head of the Financial Stability Board at the time, raised this issue of short-sightedness of markets on some long-term issues like climate change, and how it could potentially be a problem when you start thinking about the stability of the financial system as it relates to climate issues. So let me just go ahead and dive in a little bit more about TCFD. So I'll change the slide here so that you can follow with me. But the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures was actually announced right around the time of COP21 in Paris. And what it was a working group that was created to report to the Financial Stability Board. And the Financial Stability Board's aim is to strengthen the financial system and the stability of international financial markets. So the overarching goal of this task force was to develop a framework that actually allows companies to disclose their climate-related risks and opportunities in a way that allowed financial markets to price that risk and make better informed capital allocation decisions. So with the development of this task force, it ended up leading to the publishing of recommendations by the task force, which was a framework, and that was issued in the June of 2017, so almost 2 years ago. And those recommendations were actually directed at all organizations with public debt or equity, and encouraged those organizations to put climate disclosures in mainstream financial filings that follows this framework, which includes governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And so I'm not going to dive into all of the specifics of the framework, but just wanted to provide this overall picture to help set the stage. I also just wanted to briefly mention that C2ES has been hard at work in this space and helping companies to try to wrap their hands around these recommendations. And so I just wanted to highlight a couple of the reports that we've issued over the last couple of years. The first one we issued in September of 2017 that highlighted some of our key takeaways from the TCFD final recommendations. And one of those was that there's just a lot of work that needs to be done to enable better reporting of climate-related financial information. And then one of those areas that we thought needed more guidance, or corporates needed more guidance on, was around scenario analysis. So then last year we developed a series of webinars and a roundtable and talked with companies about how they could use scenarios to better assess the climate-related risks and opportunities. So that report, kind of following all of that work, was issued last August and kind of dives into best practices around using scenarios. And then this year, we've actually held a few more workshops to dive in a little more deeply on how to engage internal stakeholders and really go through the process of starting a scenarios exercise, and then how to appropriately narrow it down into a process that really delivers meaningful outcomes or information to stakeholders. Likewise, we dove in a bit more on how companies are assessing physical impacts of climate change and how they're integrating that with some of their strategic and risk management work that they're already doing. So keep an eye out on some more reports, or another report rather, this fall that will share some of the insights that we gleaned from those conversations. So with that, I'm more than happy to move on to our panelists and hear from them on some of their areas of expertise before we dive into a discussion. So Sarah, I'm going to hand things over to you. Just a reminder, Sarah is Senior Associate of Mergers and Acquisitions and Capital Markets at Vinson Elkins. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Nancy. So I think from my perspective, from the legal perspective, the story of climate change disclosure really begins with discussing how it developed in what we refer to as the ESG space, which is environmental, social, and governance, how that conversation has changed over the past 2 decades among investors, and particularly investors in public companies rather. And now we see the development shifting over to private companies as well. But I think beginning, about 2 decades ago, we did start to see investors, significant investors in the public company space, start to have conversations around additional disclosures from companies, expecting companies to start to speak to some of these issues, including climate change. And early conversations in the space were among investors that were what we'd consider kind of some of the smaller investors with a very specific focus on these matters. We didn't see the likes of BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard start to speak to these issues in a really public way until slightly more recently. But it began kind of on the fringes, as these things kind of tend to, in conversations, at least in the US, among smaller investors. And a lot of that was mirroring developments that were happening in the EU and UK with respect to ESG matters. So at the beginning, it was really, I think for a lot of public companies, it was really more almost of a branding question, whether or not they wanted to be associated with a particular type of disclosure, a particular type of voluntary disclosure that branded them in a specific way. And Nancy, before I go any further, am I in control of the slides as well, or do I need to ask you to move them forward?
Nope, I can move them for you. So just let me know when you're ready to move, and I will.
Sure, great, thank you. If you could advance one slide, that would be fantastic. Great, thank you. So here we have the story. We kind of are coming in partway through the story with this slide, discussing some of the more recent developments with respect to the large pension funds that have been driving developments in the US with respect to ESG matters generally, and then also climate change specifically. When we talk about the disclosures that companies are expected to make now, today, and how rapidly that has changed, the source of a lot of that is the pension funds and other large US-based investors demanding additional disclosures. And when they're asked about their reasons for pursuing this and wanting greater disclosure, they really point to kind of 3 things now, and that's enhanced returns, risk disclosure, which I'll come back to in a minute, and then also kind of aligning strategies across various stakeholders. And when I talk about stakeholders, you know, from the public company perspective, traditionally we're talking about investors, but now investors are the result of this is they're really driving a conversation around other types of stakeholders as well, whether that's communities, including, you know, cities and municipalities, but also individuals, both that work at these companies and then live in the surrounding areas. And so that's been a major shift. I think it's a significant shift for public companies for whom the focus has traditionally been on shareholder value. Nancy, if you could advance one more slide, that would be great. Thank you. So here, I mean, this tells an interesting story, I think, from the institutional investors' perspective and looking at climate change and other types of ESG disclosures. While the story might have begun as kind of a branding question for companies, whether or not they wanted to be out in the forefront of these disclosures with some of the first sustainability reports that we saw, now the question is really more one of value, and I think there is a connection being drawn by a lot of investors between the enhanced corporate value and additional disclosures around climate change and other ESG matters. One more slide, please. Thanks, Nancy. So I think, you know, we're focusing specifically on TCFD, but I think it's important to remember that it lies in this broader world of all of these different type of regimes asking for different types of information, whether that is asking companies to specifically disclose types of information or whether that's rating a company on its practices with respect to disclosure or operations. And we've seen in the past, particularly I would say in the past 10 years, a real plethora of these regimes. And I think the result is that some companies, particularly I would say companies in the energy space that have been having to address these questions for perhaps a longer period of time than companies in other types of industries, become a little exhausted with the amount of disclosure that they're having to put out there and the number of regimes that they're having to kind of consider. I think one of the questions I get asked the most often from our public company clients in particular is whether or not we expect to see any sort of consistency, you know, any sort of arriving at a central place with respect to how disclosures are expected to be framed. And I think in the near term, the answer is probably not. I think, you know, you do obviously, excuse me, have your standards that are more of a point of focus, TCFD, CDP, that folks kind of hold out as a standard that more public companies are using. But I think in terms of the number of regimes, we're just going to, for a while yet, continue to see them grow in number and complexity until the data question is solved, until there's more consistent information with respect to climate change and other ESG matters that companies can use and rely on. I think we're probably not going to see real consistency across regimes. Nancy, if you could advance one more slide. So this is a little bit of a complex slide, but I think it's worth just noting that the backdrop for all of this with respect to disclosure is a question of materiality. And for public companies in particular, this can get a little thorny because you have these different standards of materiality. You have the SEC standard. The SEC, as a reminder, still has yet to come out and specifically say that climate change disclosure and matters around climate change is material for the purposes of all companies across the board. They've kind of danced around the issue of materiality and climate change disclosure, I think, pretty intentionally. And so the question becomes for companies, for public companies in particular, if they're going to disclose matters, risks and opportunities around climate change, are they by implication saying that those items are material, and are they then taking on a level of liability with respect to those disclosures, similar to how financial disclosures function? And so that's something to just remember. It's something that we frequently have to work with our clients to grapple with, because if they are complying with, for example, if they are issuing a TCFD report, the question then becomes, how do we frame that in a way that doesn't necessarily assign a level of liability to those disclosures that the company is not necessarily comfortable with, particularly given data gaps and assumptions that they have to put in place in order to create these types of disclosures. Nancy, if you could advance one more slide, that would be great. Thanks. So, I mean, this becomes the debate, the comparable data debate, right? And whether or not companies are at any given point in time going to be able to have data that is consistent and comparable across company and industry. That's what companies are wrestling with. But I think ultimately what we see is that there's a deeper benefit to actually creating these disclosures, and that is that the company internally has to have the conversation around it. And so there's a benefit there, even though the ultimate report, which is produced, may not have, quote unquote, perfect information, right, just because of where we are in the process. But the deeper internal understanding of a company's ESG risks and opportunities has some value. And I think while the focus for many investors has been on the disclosure side, I think more and more we're seeing sophisticated investors recognize that there is a kind of a deeper value to the process itself, as opposed to kind of the ultimate disclosure being the main focus. Great. And there are more slides in the deck. I actually am not going to speak to every single slide. There are some more slides around considerations for climate change disclosures and the types of questions that we expect companies to be asking themselves in advance of creating climate change disclosures specifically. But with that, I'm going to turn it back to Nancy.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. There was a lot to dive in. You really covered a lot of ground already. So I'll just briefly go through the last few slides so that folks can see them on their screen for just a second before we go ahead and pass things over to Bill. And I think that your final remarks there really were a great segue to Bill's remarks, and that, what I think Bill can really share with us is how Exelon has taken this process of looking at climate risks and opportunities and talk to us about what that means for their business and how they've maybe found that process useful. So with that, I'd like to introduce Bill Brady, who's Vice President of Corporate Environmental Strategy at Exelon now. So Bill.
Thank you very much, Nancy. It's my pleasure to be here this afternoon. I want to thank Sarah for providing a wonderful context for the remarks I'd like to share with you that focus on how we have undertaken efforts to actually do scenario analysis so that we can more closely align with the expectations that are out there, specifically the TCFD guidance addressing risk, strategy, metrics, and governance. And I'm going to describe at a high level the work that we did over the past 12 months to scope analysis that helps inform what future scenarios might look like and what they might mean to our business in terms of impacts and opportunities and the implications of climate change. This is very much an evolving area of study and research, and as we undertook our work, it became immediately clear that there are not a lot of definitive approaches that have been established for doing scenario analysis. Before we even began our work, we did some benchmarking of other prominent companies. Some of them are on the Business Environmental Leadership Council, and there are many ways to approach this work, but fundamentally, I believe, and our company believes, that there's tremendous value in doing scenario analysis because it does help inform how you approach the risks, develop the strategy, and then ultimately measure your progress towards addressing the issues. Perhaps the primary motivation for Exelon to undertake this work was really driven by the growing level of interest from our investors and other stakeholders. During the past 18 to 24 months, I've participated in more than 30 calls with our investors, and you would recognize them, the Fidelities, the Vanguards, some of the major private equity firms. They're all asking us, what do we think about TCFD? How could it be useful? What are we planning to do? What have we done? And so I think those conversations have helped share for us that there really isn't a crisply defined standard, even though TCFD provides excellent guidance. The practical matter of how you undertake the work to conform to that standard or those guidelines is still very much a product in evolution. One of the benefits that we gained from undertaking this work is that it fully engaged our board as well as our senior leadership, and it gave us the opportunity to raise the discussion up to that level and also compelled us to put a level of rigor against it that we previously hadn't. And now we're beginning to take the results of that work and use it to evolve our strategy and our planning. So Nancy, if you could go to the next slide, which is the forward-looking statement slide. And the reason I just want to pause here for a second is twofold. One, the practical matter that my counsel advised that I put it in here. But secondly, it illustrates that this topic, the opportunities and risks of climate change and how to disclose them, is very much a sensitive topic in terms of what ultimately goes in the SEC filings and what we talk about publicly. And as I'll get into in a few minutes, even though we've done the scenario analysis, it is by no means a definitive analysis of what the future is going to look like for Exelon, but rather it helps inform our thinking. And so the challenge fundamentally is, how do you talk about work that is evolving in a way that is meaningful to stakeholders, but at the same time not misleading to investors? And that balance becomes the challenge. Next slide, please. To give you a little context of who Exelon is and what we do, we are a public utility holding company. We own and operate 6 utilities, primarily in the Chicago, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and Mid-Atlantic region. And we also have a large generation company that is comprised of 32,000 megawatts of electric generating capacity. A couple relevant statistics to that: about 86% of the electricity that we produce is carbon-free, comes from our nuclear power plants. About 10% of what we produce comes from natural gas plants, and about 10% of our generating capacity is renewables, and that produces about 3.5% of the output that we deliver each year to our 12 million retail customers. We operate almost exclusively in the 48 contiguous United States. And so while the issue of climate change is a global issue, for us, it is very much an issue that is local to the U.S., but global implications can impact our view on the future, and they become very important as we begin to develop scenarios. Next slide, please. Just to put a slightly finer point on the generation profile, because we are somewhat uniquely positioned in that sector in the United States, there's 2 very key differentiating characteristics. One is that we're the largest producer of emission-free electricity in the U.S. by about a factor of 2 to the next company. And secondly, the average CO2 emissions rate from our generating fleet is on the order of 100 pounds per megawatt hour, which is very close to the ultimate target that the entire U.S. generating mix would need to achieve by 2050 if we're going to move towards the target of reducing emissions by 80% or more economy-wide by that time. So this is a big challenge for us today, maintaining this position. A large percentage of our generating capacity is nuclear power. I think folks may be aware that the current market pricing mechanisms do not recognize the value of clean generation. And so therefore those assets are subject to economic viability based on prevailing market pricing and market rules, which can be challenging as these plants feel pressure, as many plants do, from other lower cost options that have essentially zero fuel costs. So we're trying to work to establish some value in the market for carbon-free generation, but in the interim, a number of these assets are challenged. Next slide, please. So let me move on to the work that we did and try to summarize it. We basically undertook an analysis to model the U.S. economy and understand what would it take in order to move the U.S. economy to a future that has 80% lower emissions compared to 1990 emissions using the UN target as the criteria. We developed a reference case based on a business as usual scenario that is essentially the 2018 EIA Annual Energy Outlook reference case. We made some refinements to the future of nuclear capacity. We're not quite as optimistic as EIA might be. And relative to natural gas pricing, our view is that natural gas prices will continue to align more closely with the high technology case rather than the base reference case. But for those adjustments, we essentially used the EIA case as the reference case. The other bookend, if you will, to these two scenarios, and there is a range of plausible scenarios between the two, but we wanted to bound it. We looked at a market-driven mitigation scenario. That is a scenario whereby the U.S. economy moves towards a lower carbon profile in all sectors where reductions can be achieved, not just electric generation, but transportation, buildings, industry, and others. The only one that we did not really look at changing is agriculture and forest sequestration. We basically assumed what is currently assumed in the EIA analysis for those areas. We developed a model for each of the sectors. We established a carbon budget for how much those sectors would have to reduce their emissions, and then we looked at a range of technological and policy options to achieve outcomes to the maximum extent in each of those sectors with the objective of getting to an 80% reduction economy-wide by 2050. And what we found was that in the base case, the business as usual case, today about 82% of primary energy is from fossil fuels. And in the market-driven scenario, what effectively happens is that primary energy moves from a fossil basis to a non-emitting basis. And by 2050, in the market-driven case, about 86% of primary energy comes from non-emitting sources. So you can appreciate that that is a substantial and aggressive shift in how the U.S. economy would source energy and use energy. And I'll explain in a minute some of the insights that we got from this analysis. But even using these two fundamental scenarios, it gave us a lot of good insight on how the economy could evolve if we were to move towards that 80% reduction. We also took the results of both of these scenarios and stress tested them against the actual physical changes that are projected to occur. And I'll share with you some of our insights in how those changes could impact the outcomes. Some of the key takeaways from doing this work, it's clear that there are huge uncertainties. The analyses are driven largely by the assumptions, and depending on how you shape the assumptions, you can get significantly different responses. What we tried to do was take existing technologies, plausible policy pathways, plausible consumer adoption rates, and forecast those out to their maximum potential and use their contribution to reducing emissions to achieve the emissions budgets for each of the sectors that we looked at. Even though we looked at these two bookend scenarios, which are very different, we learned that even if we were to get on the 80% reduction by 2050 pathway today, and we are not on that pathway, but if we were to be on it, we would still see meaningful physical impacts. And that's due to the momentum built up in the Earth systems. It will take decades for those changes to really occur. So one of the challenges is that we're looking at the prospect of making substantial changes to the economy, but the benefits of those changes don't necessarily begin to be realized until the second half of the century. So that can be a challenge from a communications perspective, if nothing else. Can we have the next slide, please? So in terms of mitigation, we looked at what the target would be for the U.S. economy based on 1990 emissions. Where do we have to get to? And basically, it's an 80% reduction on about 5.5 billion tons net in the U.S. economy. And that is a pretty substantial reduction that needs to occur even between the current time and 2050 over the next 30 years. And as I said earlier, we did not really make any changes to the assumptions on land use. We held that constant, although we recognize that there are opportunities to utilize land use as a means to sequester carbon and further reduce carbon emissions. Next slide, please. From a mitigation perspective, we looked at 4 key building blocks across the economy. On the demand side, some of the pretty obvious options are to improve efficiency and utilize conservation of energy. We found a great deal of opportunity in electrification, specifically in transportation, which represents about the same percentage of U.S. total emissions as electric power generation. And so we made some very aggressive assumptions about where technology could go for space conditioning, for electrification of light duty and even heavy duty vehicles, as well as other modes of transportation. In the industrial sector, there's opportunities to utilize electrification for heating and other process steps. But the industrial sector is one of the more challenging sectors to reduce emissions in because of some of the unique process requirements. The third leg on the demand side was to move towards low carbon fuels, including biofuels, as well as the use potentially of synthetic fuels and hydrogen to displace carbon emissions. On the supply side for energy, the major shift was to move from fossil fuels to non-emitting fuels. And so while we electrify transportation and we move towards use of electricity in other sectors, we're going to have to decarbonize the generation supply while at the same time growing it substantially. So the growth of low carbon electricity becomes one of the major keys to achieving the 80 by 50 outcome from an energy supply perspective. Next slide, please. This chart illustrates, based on our analysis, for the market-driven outcome versus the business as usual case, what the major contributors are to achieving that 80% reduction by 2050. And you can see in the chart the light blue wedge at the bottom from electrification, largely in space conditioning and transportation. The tan wedge in the middle represents the shift in electric supply from the current mix to effectively a generation supply that is 95% or more emissions free. And then there's opportunities in the industrial sector with carbon capture as well as biofuels and ultimately use of energy efficiency. Some of the key insights are that when we look at what is possible under aggressive scenarios, we were able to get to an 80% reduction by 2050. In order to get there, though, it requires significant action throughout the economy immediately, and that we must sustain significant progress over the next several decades. We looked at utilizing and deploying all commercially available, viable supply and demand options, and we need to deploy all of them. This is not a situation where one option should be considered over another. We need to deploy all viable options, and even when we do, there's very little margin, if any, left in our ability to achieve the 80% reduction outcome. In order to risk manage that outcome, we need to be investing in R&D. And on the supply side, it's not really a question of renewables versus nuclear versus other options, such as carbon capture and storage or battery storage. All of the above need to be deployed in their maximum potential in order to achieve the 80% reduction. From a cost perspective, we looked at what this would represent to the U.S. economy. You may be familiar with the National Climate Assessment, their views on what the GDP impact could be by the end of the century from climate change, something on the order of 10%. And what we found was that by making an investment on the order of 1% of annual U.S. GDP in mitigating climate change through emissions reduction, we could effectively achieve an 80% reduction and forestall or avoid the cost to the economy in the latter half of the century. So at a very high level, I think there's an economic value proposition that suggests that taking action now is in the best interest of the long-term U.S. economy. Next slide, please. Shifting a little bit to the physical changes, we looked at several key physical changes, those related to temperature, storm intensity and frequency, precipitation that could relate to transient flooding and other damages, as well as sea level rise. And we wanted to understand how these physical changes would impact our business from a demand perspective for electricity, how it could impact our infrastructure, and whether or not some of the communities that we currently serve would continue to be there in the coastal region 20, 30, 40 years into the future. So this analysis gave us insight into that, and if I can have the next slide, please. From a geographic perspective, it was important for us to understand the impacts at a local or regional level. We operate in a number of different geographic areas. They all have somewhat unique physical exposure to climate change, particularly in the mid-Atlantic, in New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland. We are subject to sea level rise as well as other weather phenomenon. Texas is subject to temperature extremes, and in the Midwest, weather volatility can be an issue. So it became important for us to not only do this analysis, but to do it at a level of granularity that gave us relevant insights for the particular regions. Next slide, please. Nancy, if I could have the next slide. Thank you. We looked at a number of parameters, but just to illustrate the point, these two charts are the relative cooling degree day changes and heating degree day changes that occur over the calendar year through 2050, which is noted. And you can see how the number of cooling degree days increases substantially relative to the number of heating degree days. When you net that out, it signals an increase in the demand for energy to support that cooling demand that is much greater than the reduction in energy required for heating. So net, there's an overall increase in demand due to climate change for more energy to support cooling. And each of the curves on here represents one of the key cities for our markets. And we gathered this data with support from NOAA for each of our local markets, not only for temperature, but also precipitation, wind, sea level rise, and so forth. And we were able to integrate that to better understand how it could impact our business. Next slide, please. I just want to highlight a couple of the key insights we gained from doing this work from a physical change perspective. In the mid-Atlantic, for example, in the coastal regions, it was quite sobering to learn that we could see as much as a 2-foot rise in average sea level by 2050. And in those regions where, average elevations are on the order of 10 feet, a 2-foot rise in sea level can be quite significant. We also see in a number of regions, the hottest days are projected to be 7 to 9 degrees F hotter than current. And so that has an impact on equipment, on demand, and the efficiency of generation. So what we attempted to do was take all this information and begin to understand over the next 30 years, what could it mean to the business, and how do we need to begin thinking about contingencies should a scenario such as this or other versions of a scenario begin to transpire. Next slide, please. And finally, just to bring this back to the topic at hand around disclosure, I hopefully have tried to make the point that there is a lot of uncertainty in this analysis. It certainly is not a definitive approach that will predict the future, but rather it's an exercise that helps us understand some of the outcomes that could occur in the future, and it gives us the ability to further refine our perspective so that we can incorporate it into strategy, better manage the risk, and begin to measure some of the key parameters and track them over time so that we can see which way these scenarios are unfolding. From a disclosure perspective for the SEC, I think we are still challenged on whether some of the risks and opportunities are probable. There are certainly probabilities that they could occur, but whether they're probable or not is a question. Can we estimate them? I think there's still a lot of uncertainty. That's a challenge. And relative to materiality, this is probably the one issue we struggle with most. Although there are impacts to the business, many of the impacts may not reach the level of materiality that we traditionally use. So we need to continue to pursue this work and And in the interim, through our annual sustainability report and our carbon disclosure project disclosures, we tried to provide as much information as possible regarding the work we're doing. And I look forward to having more discussion today with all of you about these topics. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Bill. Really appreciate all of that detail that you're able to provide us, giving us a really good look under the hood in terms of what Exelon has done to assess some of the physical and transition impacts related to climate change. So we've gotten tons of questions. I think in the thinking through the time that we have available, I want to go ahead and move on to hear some of Susie's remarks, kind of hearing that more local, regional level and how a city is kind of grappling with some of the same issues and how she's been working with stakeholders with the city of Miami Beach and surrounding communities. So with that, I'd love to pass the baton over to Susie Torienti. Susie?
Good afternoon, and thank you, Nancy. I want to thank Bill and Sarah for some great information. Thank you very much. Greetings, everyone from South Florida, and I'm going to run through a few slides here and essentially talk about a real-life case study of our first experience talking about our climate risks with the financial community. If you go to the next slide, I'll go ahead and tell you a little bit about Miami Beach. We are 7 square miles, barrier island nestled in between the Atlantic Ocean and Biscayne Bay. We are only 90,000 residents. Most people think Miami Beach is a lot bigger, but 90,000 residents. But we do get per day about 250 people coming in and out of our city with folks who work here and tourists, of course. We sit on porous limestone, like South Florida, of course, and we're essentially flat. Some flat and flatter is the way I like to say it. On the actual ocean side, we're higher elevation because of our dunes. We're at about 12 feet above sea level, and then on the bay side, really a lot lower, closer to 2. And I'll show some pictures later showing how we've adapted and how we continue to adapt. But I want to start with this kind of the first experience in climate disclosure, and take you back to last fall when the city of Miami Beach put a general obligation bond question on the ballot, and our residents approved it overwhelmingly, really by 70%. And it was to fund projects in these 3 different categories: parks and culture, neighborhood infrastructure, and public safety. Essentially, 59 projects were adopted, and we expect to, pay them back in about approximately, 10 to 12 years or so. So, if you go to the next slide, fast forward then to the spring of this year, where our financial team was working hard and getting ready to go up to New York and, meet with the rating agencies and talk about, Miami Beach and our program, our capital program and our financing program. And then for the first time, I'm sitting at my office one day, and the team from the finance department came in and said, "We have some questions for you about the bond program." And I said, "You probably are in the wrong office. I'm assistant city manager over a lot of planning and strategy and resilience, but not necessarily ever been involved in some sort of a financial transaction in my business line of work, if you will." So they said, no, we got questions from Moody's and Standards & Poor's, and they want to know just this: what is the city's overall strategy in terms of sea level rise? What are your greatest risks? How are you incorporating significant adaptation into your projects and into your financial planning and your capital planning? And essentially what we understood was that they wanted us to, kind of vocalize our risk, and if we knew what it was and what we were doing about it. And so if you go to the next slide, we went ahead and tried to answer the question in a very strategic manner. The next slide is first of all, we wanted to talk about strategy and planning. And we started with how we have been working on this topic really for about 10 years here in South Florida. And in the middle range there, I want to highlight the Southeast Florida Climate Compact. Miami Beach is a partner in the Climate Compact. It has been around for 10 years, and it is an agreement amongst the 4 counties of the Southeast Florida, the Monroe County and the Keys, Miami-Dade, where we are, Broward, and Palm Beach up to the north. It's an area of about 6 million people, and the 4 counties and their municipal partners agreed to start to plan and share information and collaborate on issues of climate adaptation and mitigation. And the folks that we talked to were actually quite impressed with, that body of work and the fact that there were all sorts of tools that local governments can use. And I think most notably, it's the unified sea level rise projections for the region, where we are planning for about 6 to 10 inches of sea level rise by 2030, 14 to 26 inches by 2060. And then when you really look out to 2100, more like 31 to 61 inches. Those projections were based on numbers from 2015, and they're actually in the process of being updated right now, and we plan to see updated numbers by the end of the year. But so that's about 10 years worth of work in this area and really informing actions in cities. If you fast forward then to 2015, 2016, we applied and we were chosen to be part of 100 Resilient Cities and pioneered by the Rockefeller Foundation. We did this in partnership with Miami-Dade County, the city of Miami, and we formed Resilient Greater Miami and the Beaches. And we just released our Resilience 305 strategy. 305 is our area code, and it is the resilience strategy for the entire geographic Miami-Dade. And then through that process, we also updated the city's strategic plan so that we actually start to have that common framework and establish goals around our vulnerabilities and our shocks and our stresses, and then really started to align an awareness of risk, but couple it with the budget process and the projects that we're putting into place to, live and thrive with an awareness of our conditions around us. So the next slide just calls out our approach. We're aware of our risks related to climate change, to sea level rise, to flooding. That's no secret, and I think anybody who, you can pick up any, national, global publication, and often Miami is the poster child for flooding and sea level rise. But more importantly, the message for us is that we've made a decision to adapt to climate change. And we do this by investing in our aging infrastructure, modernizing it, and we're using that best available science and engineering to do so. We're using the sea level rise scenarios from the compact, from our local partners, the firms that we hire to work with us. We make sure that in the procurement process, they are aware of these tools and our strategy, our philosophy, and our approach. And then it's beyond stormwater investments and infrastructure investments. We're also updating our land use code and our zoning code so that as new construction comes into play, and as we look at our historic properties, how are they also adapting? If you go to the next slide, here's a nice sort of visual of what we've done with our stormwater program. You can see here some before and after pictures of a neighborhood in Miami Beach called Sunset Harbor. It is on the bay side, and you'll see that it was sunny day flooding that caused the waters to come up through the older gravity pipes of our stormwater system. And so we went through in a very aggressive process of raising the roads, putting in pipes, putting in seawalls, and you'll see also in the sort of the new urban landscape, you have some split sidewalks in certain areas because some buildings are at a higher elevation and some of the older buildings are at a lower elevation. So this is really how our resilience journey began, if you will, investing in that public infrastructure through the stormwater program, making those investments. But in 2017, we had a new commission and new mayor come into play, and they decided to look at our stormwater program, and they decided to let's go ahead and look at the program and excuse me for a second. Sorry about that. I got a quick interruption. In 2017, we went ahead and looked at our program and we said, how are we doing with our program? How are we doing with our stormwater program? Can we make some certain adjustments? And so we decided to pivot a bit, and moving forward, our stormwater program is actually going to be a little bit more complete. This obviously is a lot of gray infrastructure. We're going to be looking to more natural ways and natural systems, using more open space and using more blue and green infrastructure to also adapt to sea level rise. If you go to the next slide, here's an illustration of how we're amending our land use code to adapt as well. So here's a home under construction, and that's our floodplain manager. What he's illustrating is one of our more notable ordinances is that we have changed our minimum base flood elevation for homes. The minimum base flood for FEMA here in Miami Beach, and most of South Florida, is 8, and we're saying freeboard can be a foot to 5 feet higher. So he's illustrating how the lowest living floor of the house is elevated 5 feet above the base, and that's essentially going to be the first floor. So that's definitely a higher level of protection, if you will. That's an extreme example. That is 5 feet, but we're seeing homes being permitted at anywhere between like 2 and 5. And again, that's really, where are you building? What's your appetite for risk? And if you build higher, of course, your flood insurance will be lower. We've also, during the land use process, we've incorporated sea level rise and resilience review criteria for our land use boards. We're making sure that when people are building on Miami Beach, there is an awareness and they're taking this into consideration, and it's discussed and called out during the development and permitting process. We have new higher elevation requirements for seawalls. We have increased green spaces with more setbacks, so increased water retention. And we're in the process right now, hopefully by this fall, we will have produced for the historic properties design guidelines. We have older properties. We have, you may be familiar with South Beach, the Art Deco buildings, the Miami Modern from the mid-century. And some of those older homes, of course, are much lower and not meeting today's FEMA standards. We also want to make sure that those homes have an opportunity to adapt. And we want to create that tool so that a homeowner, a property owner, can then start to invest in their property and make sure that older stock continues to invest and adapt as well. And so the last couple of slides is really about the results. We were able to answer the questions from Moody's and from S&P. We basically told them about our partners, our policies, our plans, and our projects. And we were able to show specific linkages amongst all these other things. And we're really pleased that when we got the report, our ratings remained strong and steady. And we had language like this, that in our view, the city maintains amongst the most robust plans to address climate change risks that we've reviewed for local U.S. governments. That was definitely something that we were very proud of. They obviously called out the risk, and they're aware of it, and they're going to continue to look at us. But this goes to show you that cities have to do something about it. And in neighboring cities and other cities that I've talked to since this, I've actually said, if we do nothing, this is going to actually financially hurt you. If you start to invest now and you can make these connections and tell your story, I think you're obviously a much more attractive, in terms of risk, if you will. But the next slide is just the same sort of call out from Moody's, where management has invested substantially in the road raisings and the sidewalks. Management includes sea level rise assumptions in all capital planning and will continue to invest in climate change mitigation and adaptation. They specifically called out what we've done. They specifically called out the fact that we were selected by Rockefeller and 100RC, basically saying that we're going to be in the forefront of new information and policies. And so that was definitely a nod to the work that we're doing and the way we're connecting all the dots. And so the last slide is just our website, and I invite everyone to learn more about our program. We call it MB Rising Above, the last slide. And that's where we can really learn more about, and if you have the time, learn more about our partners, whether it's the Southeast Florida Climate Compact, the Resilient 305 partners, the universities that we partner with and study us as their living laboratories, from local universities like the University of Miami, FIU, but as far away as Harvard and Columbia have partnered with us. And that really makes us a stronger city. We're doing something about our issues, but we continue to enjoy and live in beautiful Miami Beach. So with that, I'll close and look forward to the dialogue over the next few minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Susie. Great case study there on the city of Miami Beach. You all are doing a lot of good work there, and really appreciate you taking the time to share with us some of that work that you're doing. So now I'd love to move into the Q&A portion of the webinar. We've gotten a lot of questions. We'll likely not be able to get to them all, but we'll try to get to as many as we can in the next 25 minutes. I think maybe a good place to start out with is around this question of opportunities. That was a question that came up at least once or twice in the Q&A box here. We heard a lot about risk, but I'm curious if the panelists could maybe share how either their businesses or cities from Exelon or City of Miami Beach perspective view some of the analysis that they're doing as opening up potential opportunities. So maybe, Susie, since we ended with you, maybe we'll go right back to you and see if you can dive in a little bit more on the opportunities side of that equation.
That made me think of a colleague, a professional colleague from the Greater Miami Chamber of Commerce, and she's from the private sector, and we co-chaired the Resilience Committee at the Chamber, which a couple of things that are interesting, that a business chamber would have a resilience committee, and they would ask a government person to be on there to co-chair it. But she always talks about risk and opportunities in the same breath, and how this is an opportunity for the business sector to be creative and innovative and not be afraid to participate in finding solutions to our risks. In fact, we actually host the yearly Sea Level Rise Solutions Summit at the Chamber, because in her view, and really a lot of the folks at the Chamber, this shouldn't be something that we're afraid of. This is an issue here in South Florida for us of flooding and sea level rise that we can manage over time if we have the courage to adapt, to invest, and really be creative and engage the business community to be part of that solution.
Great, thanks, Susie. Bill, curious what your thoughts are, how Exelon is perhaps using this analysis to think about the opportunity side of the equation.
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. It's a great question. I do think some of us have a bias when we do these analyses. We look at the downside, but maybe not so much at the upside. And so two aspects. One is on the sort of the electricity production side. As I noted, the current generation asset mix is going to have to transform substantially if we're to mitigate even a fraction more of the emissions than we have today. And so that represents incredible opportunity to deploy clean technologies, new technologies, and really transform, where we get electrical power from. So there's a big opportunity there. There's challenges in doing it, but at least from an opportunity perspective, there is one. From the delivery side or the demand side, there's opportunity in our business to transform the infrastructure that we've known for almost 100 years. That is, how do we get electricity from the generating plant to our homes and businesses? We're already beginning to make substantial investments in transforming that infrastructure to make it more efficient and to allow it to more readily accommodate increasing amounts of distributed energy resources, whether it's rooftop solar, community energy, or energy storage. Those technologies will all play a key role in shaping where we get energy and how we use it in the future. So again, I think on both sides of our business, we see a lot of opportunity.
Great, thanks, Bill. Sarah, I'm not sure, you work with a broader swath of companies, if you've seen trends in the opportunity sides that you'd like to maybe share with folks in the webinar.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think it really does depend on sector from my perspective with respect to whether companies are kind of more focused on the risks or the opportunities. Obviously, I think for public companies, the focus on risk is in part driven by their existing disclosure obligations and then any voluntary disclosure that they are choosing to pursue. But I think, you know, we do work with companies that by their very strategy, by their very mandate, their business mandate, are involved in looking at the opportunities on the climate change side. And so I think you can see companies, for example, in technology and similar industries, a little more focused on kind of a balance between risks and opportunities. I think until more data is kind of widely accessible for companies and conducting their analysis, will continue to have a little bit more of a focus on the risk side as opposed to the opportunity side for public companies.
Great. Another question for you, Sarah. I know that you had said that we're still a ways away from maybe seeing a lot of consistency with disclosures. But that being said, you know, there is a lot of focus and interest on it. And with Susie's presentation, we heard about how what they're doing on resiliency is affecting their municipal bond ratings. And I'm just curious, from a corporate perspective, if you're seeing more disclosures or analysis, or the pressure to do analysis on this is changing access to capital for any folks on the corporate side.
I think it is. I think for publicly held companies, more and more you're seeing large institutional investors at least take these things into consideration. We've also seen rating agencies like Moody's and the like say that they're going to continue to take this and other, you know, ESG matters into consideration in setting ratings. So I think we are seeing it. I think on the private company side, without a doubt, you know, we in our representation of, you know, private equity firms and the like, you know, are aware of the ways in which they conduct their due diligence for investments, and there is without a doubt an ESG lens, and particularly a climate change lens, depending on the industries that they are investing in and the location of those businesses. But I think we are seeing it become an access to capital issue. I think that's growing as the pool of resources that is dedicated to not just kind of a casual interest in ESG matters, but really eliminating certain types of investment based on concerns around climate change and similar risks.
Great, thanks. Another area where we've gotten a few questions is really around how folks frame their analysis on this. And one question in particular was how you frame, you're being asked by folks or shareholders, stakeholders, to consider both the short, medium, and long-term risks and opportunities presented by climate change. Curious, just from a definitional standpoint, how you think about those different timeframes. Maybe I'll shoot that over to Bill first.
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. as a result of the work we did on the scenario analysis, we actually have shifted our time horizon for strategic analysis. In the past, we would do a 5-year plan, which was sort of our financial plan, our budgets and such, and then we would do a 10-year strategy horizon. And based on the work we've done, we've begun to move that horizon out for financial planning and have taken it out on a pilot basis to see what we could do out to 2030. And so we're beginning to evolve sort of the time horizon. And the challenge, as I noted earlier, is that it's unclear what pathway we're actually going to be on, 5 years out, 10 years out, 20 years out. And so having a more detailed analysis and a longer-term time horizon gives us a platform for at least running a variety of different scenarios and options to see what's the most optimal planning approach or strategic approach that we could take and still maintain flexibility to shift depending on actual conditions.
Thanks, Bill. Anybody else feel like they have a good answer to that? I'm happy to have Sarah or Susie jump in too. If not, we can go to the next question.
Well, it's Susie. I could, kind of from the government perspective, we obviously have, annual budgets, but we're using the climate the compact sea level rise scenarios to help us with capital planning. And so short term 2030, mid 2060, long term 2100. And that helps us when we're thinking about, what we're going to build and how long we expect that infrastructure to last. Also, on a very practical note, our Resilient 305 strategy, which is that regional plan that was created with the help of the Rockefeller Foundation, that went through a very process that was held by all the different cities around the world. And it's intended to be a 20-year vision, but with actions that can be accomplished within 1-year election cycle for us. So it's kind of long-term, but also practical.
Thanks, Susie. That actually leads into another question that we received, mostly on how you're using some of these scenarios that you're looking at. And there might be a difference between the scenario that you just described, Susie, and the scenarios that Bill described, which were more of bookends. And the question was, how do you plan when you use those scenarios? If you're using an extreme scenario, so I guess, Susie, the question for you, is that an extreme scenario, the ones that you're using, or is it an average scenario? And is that ultimately what guides your planning decision and what determines what gets built or doesn't get built, or what some of the parameters around how it gets built are made? Whereas maybe for Bill, the question is, you looked at both kind of the RCP 8.5 or the 1.5 planning scenarios, and how do you decide what to use to make those capital allocation decisions? So maybe, Susie, I'll throw it to you first, and then we'll go to Bill.
Right. The scenarios we use really help start the conversation, and just the way we put the criteria in the land use development review process. We want to force the planners and the engineers to take this into account, because we don't want to build things the way we've always built them, or we don't want to replace a pipe with the same pipe that came out. And so the scenarios help us think about, what are we buying, what are we building or placing, investing, and how is that going to help us deal with future shocks and stresses? And so it really helps us start that thinking process and inform the decision-making process, so that we know, what we're building, where we're putting it, and how long do we want it to last. And in today's world, when things are different, it's not just replacement for the sake of replacement.
Mm-hmm. Bill, thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think our approach has been similar. A lot of the infrastructure we invest in has a 40-plus year life. And so clearly we're going to see physical changes that will challenge traditional design parameters. And we've been trying to take the results of our analysis and integrate it into asset planning and design parameters so that if we put in a pole to support electric distribution lines, there's a certain standard we use today, and we're looking at increasing the resiliency of those poles by going to a more stringent standard for new installations. One of the challenges of doing that, though, in our business, and even for others may have it, is that often the more resilient technology has a certain cost associated with it. So working in partnership with our state utility regulators and other key stakeholders is essential so that we have the ability to make those investments in more resilient infrastructure so that we can continue to serve our customers with the level of service that they expect.
Thanks, Bill. Sarah, I have a question for you, and this is a bigger, broader, overarching question, let's say, just in terms of tools that companies are using. If there are tools that you point some of your clients to, and ways, I guess, when even thinking about beginning the process of analyzing some of these risks and opportunities that maybe you point out that can be helpful guides for folks that are just getting started.
Sure. So I think for our clients that are just getting started, we really like to start on, the risk side. That might be because we're lawyers, but we're really looking for whether or not they have the risk enterprise management system in place to start addressing risks of this nature. So kind of more complex risks that where there might not be complete data yet. So we're going to be looking at the sophistication of their ERM, their enterprise risk management system. We're also going to be looking at the team that they have in place. Very often when we're working on climate change disclosures with a client, the issue comes up of everyone on the team speaking the same language. And so it's great if a company has the resources already in place with respect to legal analysis, scientific analysis, whether they're also including, for example, investor relations, a PR firm, in creating those disclosures. The challenge can be to get everyone on the same page with respect to the scope of the project, and then also the language around that. And so one of the challenges that we face at times with clients that have all those resources in place, they have a sophisticated risk program that enables them to really start doing a lot of this work, is the tension between those on the team that have a desire to disclose everything that the company might be doing, and of course the lawyers who spoil everything and tell the company to hold certain things back. And that just has to do with litigation around climate change disclosures. And we've seen that, of course, develop over the past couple of years into a really sophisticated area of litigation. And so anytime a company is making disclosures of this nature, there is a litigation risk, and helping our clients navigate that requires that they have the right team in place.
Thanks, Sarah. I mean, another question that we get asked is around access to data. Have you or any of your clients, or maybe this is a good question for Bill and Susie to weigh in on as well, do you have any challenges with getting access to the climate change data you need in order to do the analysis?
Without a doubt, I'll just speak briefly and then let the others weigh in, since they probably have more information on this than I do. But I think when I've worked with clients, I think without a doubt there are assumptions and estimates that have to go into any type of analysis of this kind. And yeah, there can be holes as well that a company maybe is not prepared to fill on the first go around, and we see that quite often. So one of the things that's great about the TCFD model is it is kind of a choose your own adventure. approach, and so a company doesn't necessarily have to have perfect data to create that first report. And I think that's really helpful. It's helpful when investors are understanding around that. But the fact of the matter is that some investors that are asking for this information do not really understand the science behind it, and don't understand the fact that we're dealing with time frames here that no one can entirely predict. And so I think that is a challenge, and I think it'll be a challenge going forward.
Thanks, Sarah. Bill or Susie, would you like to weigh in on that access to data question?
Yeah, Nancy, just real quick, I would say that it is a challenge. There's a lot of data out there. There's a challenge trying to downscale the global data to a local level to make it relevant. But we found that working in partnership with NOAA, they were very accommodating, very generous with their time and resources to help us not only access but use the data. And we continue to work with them so that they can make it more accessible for others.
Great. And Susie, did you want to weigh in on that one as well? Wonder if we lost Susie. With that,
oh, sorry, I was on mute.
Oh, there you are. I'll let you go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, I was on mute. It's just that I agree with Bill and everything that he said, and it's definitely a challenge for us. You know, in local government, we don't usually have all the resources or the skill set, and so we do rely on others and partners. Sometimes the frustration for us is that there may be a lot of tools out there, especially when you see a tool predicting sea level rise, and you can pop in an address, and then you can go through the exercise of 1 foot, 2 foot, or 3 feet. But we've noticed that that's a very limited tool because it hasn't taken into consideration maybe what the city's already done to adapt. So the areas where I showed you earlier in my presentation where things were like underwater in 2013 in Sunset Harbor, we've raised the road by 2 feet, we've reduced the risk, but those tools out there don't usually account for that. And so sometimes it's a frustration for us when the data leads to misleading information or conclusions.
Right, great points. With that, you know, we're getting really close to the end of our time here, so I think I'd just like to thank our panelists once again for all of the information they're able to share. I apologize for anyone who submitted questions we did not get to. If possible, we'll try to follow up on the side. I also got several questions related to the slides and if they'll be available. Yes, we can make those available, particularly to those who asked, as well as the slides and the webinar are available on our YouTube page following this webinar. Usually takes about a day or two to get those posted, so you can check those out there. The other thing I just wanted to mention is continuing our webinar series at C2ES. We're planning to have a webinar in September that's going to cover national decarbonization strategies. Be on the lookout soon. We're still getting the final date and time, but just wanted to let you all know to keep that on your radar for next month. So thanks again to everyone, and hope you all have a wonderful day.